It is the turn of the 20th century. China, a nation governed under the last great empire, the Qing dynasty, is about to bear witness to radical reforms and social changes never before seen in the country. The infamous Chinese Communist Party seizes power from the nationalist Kuomintang Party, establishing the People's Republic of China. One man of humble beginnings would change the very face of Communist China, implementing his own liberal economic policies and creating the emerging superpower that it is today. He would rise through the ranks of the Communist Party, facing many obstacles and setbacks, but would, nonetheless, ultimately become one of the most prominent figures in recent Chinese history, and arguably one of the most important political figures of the second half of the 20th century. His name, Deng Xiaoping, the father of modern China. The man known to history as Deng Xiaoping was born on the 22nd of August 1904 in Guang'an, in the province of Sichuan in southwestern China. He was a descendant of the Hakka people, a branch of the Han Chinese. His father was Deng Wenming, a landowner in rural Sichuan, who acted as the head of the Paifeng village, having been selected by the Chinese government to collect taxes and report on issues such as crime in the region. He had received a university education in law and political science in the city of Chengdu. As well as serving as a regional agent for the central government, Wenming also collected information on political activities happening around the region. In addition, his father was heavily involved in a religious sect known as the Religion of the Five Sons, which incorporated elements of all the major philosophical and religious traditions of China, such as Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. Deng's mother was Deng Danshi. Unlike her husband, she was illiterate. She had 4 children, 3 boys including Deng and a daughter. However, she was absent from Deng's life from a relatively young age, succumbing to what is now believed to have been tuberculosis, dying sometime in the 1920s. Deng was the eldest child of Wenming and Danshi. Not much is known about the future Chinese leader's early life, although he was later described by villagers who knew him as a young boy, as a stable, energetic and happy child. He was also marked out by his school friends as being playful and mischievous, though serious and intelligent too. By the age of 5 in 1909, Deng began private tutoring and received his honorary name, which was customarily provided by his teacher. This was Xixian, meaning to aspire to good. He was also trained in the classical writings of Confucius and would later attend a conventional primary school where he continued his education on the ancient philosopher's work and learned to recite passages from his writings. Deng was growing up in a time of immense change throughout China. For roughly 250 years, between the start of the 17th century and the middle of the 19th, China, Japan, and Korea had closed themselves off from contact with the outside world, and in particular the European powers that had begun arriving to the Far East, fearing that the newcomers would disturb the traditions and way of life. By the 1830s, the British, French, Americans, and others had reached a stage of technological and military development where the Chinese could no longer keep them out of their ports. The introduction of Western ideas on the back of the Opium Wars launched by the British caused immense disruption in China. The second half of the 19th century saw a gradual decline in the imperial system, overseen by the Qing dynasty. Yet, despite efforts to modernize, only political instability ensued. The imperial government finally collapsed in 1911, following which a Chinese republic was established. However, even then, a period of further unrest followed, in which traditional Chinese warlords ruled various parts of the country, while new progressive movements like the Kuomintang or nationalists and the communists began to emerge amongst the more educated middle classes of China's many great cities. These forces of modernization and instability formed the background against which Deng's life played out. Deng's life was being shaped by the forces of modernization from an early point. In 1915, when Deng was 11 years old, he attended a boarding school in Guang'an before moving on to middle school in the same district in 1919 at the age of 14, this time focusing his studies on science, mathematics, and geography. Then, in the fall of 1919, Ming enrolled both Deng and his youngest son, Xiaosheng, in the Diligent Work, Frugal Study program, whereby Chinese students were sent to France, halfway around the world, to study and learn modern Western ideas. It is inconceivable that such an educational move could have been considered for the sons of a middle-class Chinese politician from the provinces just a half-century earlier. The reason that Ming chose France for his son's education was that in China, France was deemed a bastion for political and economic learning, while also being free of much of the political baggage of British involvement in China. Deng was unable to obtain a full scholarship due to poor grades, and he also struggled with learning French, but he did pass exams which allowed him to attend school in France. Moreover, as his father was a strong believer in the future success of his own nation, he instilled in Deng values concerning the betterment of Chinese society. Deng set sail from Shanghai on the 11th of September 1920, arriving in the port city of Marseille on the 19th of October. Upon arriving in France, he and his fellow students met with representatives of the Sino-Franco Society of Education, who escorted the students to Paris. From there, Deng was sent to the town of Bayeux in Normandy to study at a secondary school. While in school in France, the young Deng complained of discriminatory treatment towards his fellow Chinese nationals, who, according to him, were treated like children, were taught at an inferior level, and were sent to bed early. Many Chinese students also found themselves without proper food or amenities and were forced into paid work during the economic recovery of France following the First World War. Deng managed comparatively well, using the resources his father had accrued by selling off his land to fund his son's education. Nevertheless, despite being in a relatively better position than his fellow students, 16-year-old Deng began working part-time for the Schneider & Company Iron and Steel Complex, which was situated between the cities of Paris and Lyon. As Deng was unsettled by the working conditions here, he decided to return to Paris after only 3 weeks of work to find employment. In the French capital, he moved into a Chinese neighborhood in the suburbs called La Garenne-Colombe. Whilst there, he survived on little funding and only communicated with his own community, as he knew very little French. Although Deng had attended school in France to learn about modern technology and science, his real interest lay in political demonstrations and movements. On the 21st of January 1921, Chinese nationals attended rallies at the Chinese embassy in France to demand better living and working conditions. Those involved criticized the work-study program and lack of employment, which resulted in funding being provided to the poorer civilians. But the social policies introduced in response by the Chinese ambassador Chun Lu were inept and did little to support those who were struggling financially. Shortly thereafter, further demonstrations took place in the southern French city of Lyon. Many of the Chinese students were forced to return home because of these, though Deng was not among them. During the next 4 years he spent in France, Deng had very little funds for schooling and continued his interest in political developments. Between 1922 and 1923, when his personal funding slowed, he again found work on factory floors, including for the French car manufacturer Renault. Despite enjoying the lifestyle in France, attending football matches and sampling the local cuisine, he later claimed the first 2 years he spent in France were the most valuable, teaching him about the uncertainties surrounding the capitalist economic system favored by Western nations. Many of the Chinese students remaining in France in the early to mid-1920s became influenced by Marxist and Leninist ideologies. This was an era when radical socialist movements were becoming more and more prominent across Europe in the aftermath of the success of the Russian Revolution of 1917. This prompted Deng to begin attending political meetings from 1923 until 1926. In 1924, he formed a close relationship with Zhou Enlai, who was responsible for covert publications released by the Communist Youth League, releasing their journal under the name The Red Lights. Deng became a fully fledged member of the organization later that year, and was responsible for writing his own newsletters. He subsequently became editor of the journal and continued to move up the ranks of the newspaper while senior colleagues returned to China. This did not go unnoticed, and soon he was being observed by the police in France. Eventually, the French authorities raided his home in January 1926, but Deng had learned that the raid was imminent and made plans to flee from France, heading across Europe by train via Berlin to Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union. In the Russian capital, under communist patronage, Deng began studying at the Soviet Union's Eastern University, primarily focusing his studies on communist theory. He soon went on to become a member of the Chinese Communist Party and was increasingly a committed Marxist. After studying at the Eastern University for a few months, Deng moved to the Sun Yat-sen University of Moscow, which was established in 1925 and named after Sun Yat-sen, a leading Chinese nationalist who had become affiliated with the Soviet Union in the first half of the 1920s. He founded the Kuomintang and the nationalist movement back in China, which ironically, after his own time, would end up involved in a civil war with the Chinese communists. At the Sun Yat-sen University, Deng continued his education in communist principles and about the broader history of China. It was also here that he was taught the Russian language, whilst also being introduced to Russian military strategies that had evolved during the First World War and the Russian Civil War that followed. He also learned that following the Opium Wars of the 19th century and China's decline as a power, many people placed responsibility on the failure of China to modernize industrially. In this light, many people had come to believe back home in China that the best way for the country to prevent foreign interference in its affairs and become a great nation again, after centuries of decline, was to industrialize. Deng became convinced through his studies that the development of a communist state would be the best way to achieve this goal. Meanwhile, events in China had become tumultuous in the years that Deng was studying in Europe. In December 1915, one of the warlords, Yuan Shikai, had attempted to reconstitute the imperial system with himself as Emperor of China. This proved abortive, and by the late spring of 1916, the Republic had been re-established. The chaos continued for years thereafter, with Sun Yat-sen playing a major role in the country's politics through the late 1910s. By 1919, his nationalist party, the Kuomintang, had become the most dominant force in southern China. Other movements also emerged, notably the Chinese Communist Party, which was founded in 1921. At this early date, the nationalists and the communists had much in common. Both wanted to bring an end to the instability wrought by the old, backward-looking warlords and to modernize China. Both were also somewhat left-leaning during Sun Yat-sen's time. Thus, they found common cause in 1926, a year after Sun Yat-sen's death, and launched the Northern Expedition, whereby nationalist leaders like Chiang Kai-shek marched north from southern China towards cities like Shanghai and Nanjing, with the goal of securing the major cities of China from the warlords and establishing a strong national government once again. By 1927, they were substantially successful in their goals and had established a new national government in the city of Nanjing. In Moscow, Deng read of events in China in 1926 and early 1927 with great interest. Eventually, he decided to leave the Russian capital and set off for Xi'an in China in early 1927, traveling via Mongolia and across the Gobi Desert. In March, he reached the front lines of the conflict and hoped to begin playing a role in the military affairs of the Northern Expedition. However, upon his arrival, Deng was consigned to delivering lectures to the army personnel of Feng Yuxiang, a commander based in northwest China who was receiving the backing of the Soviet Union. He was, though, present to see the Northern Expedition take a fateful turn, as Chiang Kai-shek led the right wing of the nationalists to engage in a purge which sought to completely undermine the left wing of the nationalists and the communists. As part of this, many communists were killed and others imprisoned for their association with the party. Deng himself was let go unharmed, thanks to Feng Yuxiang choosing not to violently purge the communists within his ranks. Still, the purge by Chiang Kai-shek in 1927 signaled the beginning of the Chinese Civil War between the nationalists and the communists, one which, in one form or another, would last for over 2 decades. The nationalists controlled the great cities in the east of the country, while the communists moved inland and built up their base there. At the start of the Chinese Civil War, Deng went to join his communist comrades in the city of Wuhan in central China, the new capital of the communist movement. These early years of the war were very difficult for the Chinese communists. Owing to internal divisions, a split occurred between the senior-ranking members, but the communists soon regrouped under new leadership. Deng, who it must be remembered was still just a young man of 22 when the Civil War began, obtained a position as a record keeper. It was at this time that he changed his name from Xixian to Xiaoping. His goal was to counter attempts at identifying him by the nationalists, but it was a name that stuck for the rest of his life, and by which he is remembered today. It was also around this time that he met a young communist leader by the name of Mao Zedong for the first time. He was also enlisted to teach the party's 7th Army and purged those disloyal to the communist movement. Deng married for the first time in 1928 to Jiang Shiyuan, who was a like-minded fellow student that he had first met in Moscow at the Sun Yat-sen University. They rekindled their relationship in China and married not long afterwards. However, it was short-lived as his wife died following complications during childbirth less than 2 years later. The baby girl she was carrying was lost as well. To compound the difficulties, Deng was also unable to attend his wife's funeral due to the nature of his work during the Civil War. He married again in 1931, his second wife being Jin Wei-ying. Little is known about her, and they separated around 1933, owing to the difficulties the communists were experiencing during these years of the Civil War. Eventually, he divorced and married for a third time in 1939 to Zhuo Lin, the daughter of a Chinese businessman. This third and last marriage would last for the rest of Deng's life and resulted in 5 children, 3 daughters, Lin, Nan, and Rong, and 2 sons, Pu Feng and Zhi Feng. In the midst of his familial shifts in the late 1920s, the communists continued to experience difficulties and military reverses in the growing conflict with the nationalists. Deng began organizing communist activity in Guangxi in the south of China in 1929 as secretary of the 7th Red Army, leading the Baise uprising of Guangxi. He also soon joined forces with Mao Zedong, whose forces were situated in the Jiangxi province, to better organize his movements following defeats to the nationalists who wore down much of Deng's remaining fighters on their journey northeast, with many dying due to exposure to the elements as they were under-equipped for this journey. In February of 1930, Mao had created the Jiangxi Provincial Soviet government in the region, but faced internal problems as he was seen as anti-revolutionary because of his moderate stance on many issues. Despite an attempted overthrow on the 7th of November 1931, Mao announced the creation of a Chinese Soviet Republic in the region he controlled in Jiangxi, though his power was diminished when control of the Red Army was given to Chinese diplomat and future head of the Chinese government, Zhou Enlai. Hence, as prominent as Mao was becoming at this juncture, he was far from the absolute leader of the Chinese communists. Meanwhile, Deng continued to be a middling official within the communist movement, though one whose talents were evident and who would continue to rise. Deng's political career was somewhat harmed by his return to Shanghai in the early 1930s to try to drum up support for the communists clandestinely in the city, leaving his army faction behind. Some felt that Deng had betrayed the party and managed to escape punishment for his actions, as he had claimed he was merely a political trainer and not a commander of war. His position was possibly safeguarded thanks to the intervention of Zhou Enlai, his old friend from his days in France. After a time, Deng returned to Jiangxi province. Despite the Communist Party's popularity, Mao was locked in internal conflicts with competing military strategists, with a frequent turnover in power causing uncertainty around the strength of their army. Opposing factions debated the military strategies being employed, with the nationalists gaining territory consistently through the early 1930s. Deng was initially demoted within the party for his allegiance to Mao, who had yet to consolidate power. But due to his long-standing commitment to the party and status as a veteran, he was subsequently promoted to party committee secretary in Ruijin, in the Ganzhou district of Jiangxi province, which was now a Soviet administrative region in China. In 1933, Deng continued to experience fluctuating fortunes within the communist movement, as some viewed him as being too right-wing, while others looked favorably on his close ties to Mao and the Jiangxi Soviet. Meanwhile, the communists as a whole were struggling to deal with a fresh attack by Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces. After a massive encirclement of their positions, Mao and his forces just managed to break out and flee westwards in 1934 before turning north. These events would become known as the Long March. They represented a low ebb for the Chinese communists, but in later years they would be lionized as the point at which Mao allegedly saved the communist cause and a piece of party law in decades to come. During it, an estimated 80,000 communist soldiers of the First Front Red Army with approximately 15,000 party members and government representatives, took part in a cross-country march, resulting in the deaths of tens of thousands of people from starvation, exhaustion, and attacks by the Kuomintang army as they moved westwards. Only 1/10 of those that made the trip north to Yan'an survived through to the end of the Long March. It was the Long March that began Mao's path to power, as he showed great leadership skills during it and so gained the support of the members of the Chinese Communist Party. It also aided Deng's further rise. In the year leading to October 1935, he was promoted to serve as a prominent secretary of the party, being promoted by Mao and Zhou. Furthermore, as party membership plummeted significantly across the country, as it looked like the communist cause was doomed, Deng rose to the inner circles of the Communist Party. During this time, he had been traveling with Mao throughout parts of their retreat. But by the end of the grueling adventure, he had begun to suffer from typhoid fever and almost succumbed to his illness. Although party membership fell, the virtue of their sacrifice in retreat was highly thought of, with many peasants hailing them as national heroes. Deng's backing of Zhou and Mao turned out to be to his advantage, as they controlled the direction of the party's military to a substantial extent thereafter. The entire Chinese Civil War took a dramatic turn in the years that followed. Back in 1931, the Empire of Japan had invaded the Manchuria region of northeastern China and had occupied it, establishing a puppet state called Manchukuo. While mired in the Civil War, neither the nationalists nor the communists were really in a position to strike back at the Japanese. Buoyed by the seeming ease with which they had acquired Manchuria, the Japanese continued to make incursions over the border into China in the mid-1930s. This eventually expanded into a full-blown invasion in 1937 after the Marco Polo Bridge incident in Beijing in July that year. The Sino-Japanese War would last from 1937 down to 1945 and is viewed by many as constituting the beginning of the Second World War in the Far East. In the first months of it, the major cities of the East fell to the Japanese, and the nationalists, like the communists had done years earlier, fled westwards into the Chinese interior. There, the communists and the nationalists formed a common cause and put aside their differences for as long as they had a common enemy in the form of the Japanese. Their capital was established in Chongqing, and they would fight together for the next 8 years. Deng spent much of the first few months of the war against the Japanese, ensconced in various guerrilla units operating in the northern provinces and trying to strike against the occupation forces in Beijing and other regions of the northeast. This set the pattern for the rest of the war, with Deng generally active in provinces like Hebei and Shanxi. He notably played a senior role in the 100 Regiments Offensive in the autumn and winter of 1940, a massive engagement between 500,000 Japanese and Chinese forces across a large front. This was symptomatic of the wider war. The clash between Japan and China was equaled in ferocity during the Second World War only by that which occurred between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. The nature of the conflict in China changed from December 1941 onwards, when Japan attacked the United States and Britain, thus providing the Chinese with new allies and a source of material aid from British Burma. Thus, by the time the US dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, and the Japanese began preparing to surrender, the uneasy coalition between the Chinese communists and nationalists were making major advances in recovering the many cities and towns along the eastern coast and rivers. Over 20 million people were dead in the Sino-Japanese clash at that stage, and the country was utterly devastated. Nevertheless, no sooner had the Second World War ended than the communists and the nationalists began preparing to resume the Chinese Civil War, which had simply been put on hiatus in 1937. Deng was involved in some brief efforts at peace talks between the two warring parties in Chongqing in the immediate aftermath of the war. These proved abortive. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists were unwilling to compromise too much, arguing that they had the upper hands before the Japanese invasion. This was true, but the communists were in a much stronger position coming out of the war, having obtained the support of a large cross-section of the Chinese population for their spirited war effort against the Japanese, whereas the nationalists left the conflict in 1945 with a reputation for inaction and appalling corruption, having embezzled a huge proportion of the financial aid the United States had sent to China to aid in the fight against the Japanese. Fighting soon resumed. In this, Deng played a key role as both a military commander and especially as an organizer and propaganda official tied to the Second Field Army. By 1948, the war had turned decisively in favor of the Communists, in large part because the Soviet Union was much more willing to aid them than the US was inclined to support the nationalists. In the final year of the conflict, Chiang Kai-shek organized a tactical withdrawal to the island of Hainan in southern China, and then to Taiwan. This was completed by the end of 1949, leaving the Communists in charge of the Chinese mainland, while the nationalist Republic of China came into being on Taiwan. Theoretically, the Chinese Civil War never really ended, but to all intents and purposes, it ended in victory for the Chinese Communists in 1949, with a mopping-up operation to take Hainan in 1950. Towards the end of the Civil War, Deng was still playing a role in the Second Field Army, which controlled Yunnan, Sichuan, Xikang, Guizhou, and Tibet to the southwest of the country. As the conflict ended in communist victory, he oversaw a process whereby many intellectuals and students in these territories were forced into re-education camps. This was part of Mao's intellectual rectification program. The communist takeover of 1949 saw the end of the Republic of China. The state would now undergo the transition to a Chinese brand of communism that would become known as Maoism. On the 1st of October 1949, Deng attended the proclamation of the People's Republic of China in Beijing, thus welcoming the newly declared communist state into being. In its earliest days of the People's Republic, Deng served as a political and military organizer as he had done in the past. He quickly found promotion under Mao, who had emerged after the war as the preeminent figure in communist China, and found Deng's political skills to be exemplary. Thus did Deng accompany Mao on a visit to Stalinist Russia in 1950 to reaffirm the close ties between the two nations at a time when the Cold War was heating up over escalating tensions in Germany and the Korean Peninsula. The visit was also organized to discuss the terms of the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance and Mutual Assistance. Much of the agreements included in this surrounded the recognition of the People's Republic of China by the Soviet Union, while matters such as infrastructural development, development of the Chinese Eastern Railway, and Soviet access to the ports of Dalian and Lushun were touched on too. These talks also secured Soviet financing for the redevelopment of China's economy after decades of war and instability. In the aftermath of the successful negotiation of the Sino-Soviet Treaty, Deng was promoted to vice premier in 1952 and held a growing number of important positions within the government, such as deputy chair of the Committee on Finance and later Minister of Finance, including a post as the director of the Office of Communications. In 1953, the increasingly powerful Mao Zedong introduced the first five-year plan, in emulation of the Soviet five-year plans that had commenced back in the late 1920s and which had transformed the Russian economy. Through these, Mao aimed for China to rapidly industrialize, furthering the country's transition into socialism. A key component of this was the collectivization of agricultural land into giant state-run farms that would then be run more efficiently, freeing up labor to work in the new factories in the cities. This would also aid in removing large estates from the hands of wealthy landowners and break down the capitalist nature of Chinese society. Following this, the intention was to reorganize industry and commerce at a later stage. Although the first five-year plan was successful economically, as industrial production grew at the rate of 19% between 1952 and 1957, agriculture lagged behind, with growth rates of 4% because of a lack of state investment, the gains coming from the reorganization and cooperation fostered by cooperative farming. Through Mao's centrally planned economy and collectivization of agriculture, the industrial economy boomed, and the country's wealth grew. Living standards improved markedly for the average person. However, more stringent plans would later be implemented, which would cause great strife across the nation. In 1954, Mao consolidated his grip on the state when he entered the office of first chairman of the People's Republic of China. Deng continued to do well during this period under Mao's patronage. He retained his place as a vice premier and later secured positions as head of the Communist Party's organization department, as well as participating as a member of the Central Military Commission. He was also instrumental in influencing legislation as a government administrative officer within the Communist Party's policy-making board. Yet a growing ideological split was developing between Deng and Mao. In 1956, the party underwent constitutional change at the first session of the 8th National Congress of the Communist Party. Deng assumed a stronger position within the party, serving as Secretary General of the Secretariat under the Politburo. He was also involved in the country's daily decision-making, alongside President Liu Shaoqi and Premier Zhou, in support of Mao. At this time, in 1956 and 1957, the 100 Flowers campaign was introduced by the government, where the people of China were allowed a rare opportunity for open criticism of the government. This, though, was not long-lived and was instead used to identify those critical of the government. Then, in 1957, Mao's anti-rightist movement emerged, which was initially supported by Deng and other leaders of the party. It would last down to the end of the 1950s, and was used as a basis for purging both the communist movement and wider society of right-wing elements. Deng was not purged in any fashion, but his position within the regime was called into question in 1958, when he formed part of a splinter group which opposed the further introduction of what was termed Mao Zedong thought into the statutes of the Chinese Communist Party. Despite his earlier rise under Mao, this signaled a clear split with the leader of the country. It was a gamble, but also points towards the fact that Mao was never as secure in his position as head of Communist China as Joseph Stalin was in his control over the Soviet Union in the 1930s and 1940s. In the second session of the 8th Congress of 1958, the Communist Party adopted the Great Leap Forward as government policy. This was the second five-year plan and was Mao's vision that the country could eclipse Britain in terms of its industrial productivity within just 5 years. The Great Leap Forward was enormously ambitious and, in retrospect, quite delusional. It aimed in particular to increase Chinese steel production to a level where it would eclipse British steel production within 5 years. Ambitious targets were also developed for the amount of coal being mined in the country and other industrial processes. To ensure that these were met, pressure was placed on regional party officers to press people out of agricultural work and into industrial factories, and then to develop maximum efficiencies countrywide in the factories and mines. The result was a catastrophic famine, as party officers forced so many people off the farms that food production suffered. In some instances, the local communist officials were even known to melt down farm implements like plows and basic tools in order to increase the amount of steel they could claim was being produced. There were also problems around infrastructural projects like dam construction being undertaken in a poor and rushed fashion, leading to flooding months later and the drowning of agricultural land. By 1959 and 1960, an appalling famine was occurring, and Mao's position and authority were immensely damaged. Tens of millions of people died across China. The exact death toll is still widely disputed. As terrible as these events were, though, they benefited Deng's career. In the aftermath of the disastrous Great Leap Forward, Mao was weakened and his political rivals saw an opportunity to move to undermine his authority. A branch of the party, one which included economic reformers like Deng and Liu Shaoqi, now sought to convince the party leaders that a new approach might be employed. At the 7,000 Cadres Conference of 1962, their proposals were greeted warmly. Mao was not in a position to aggressively oppose these. All the same, it was clear that a division had emerged between the leader and the young protege who had risen under him back in the 1930s. Further divisions were seen when Mao recommended developing what he termed the Third Front movement in the mid-1960s. By this, he meant that China needed to become more industrially and militarily independent from the Soviet Union in the context of the Cold War, owing to the growing rift between Moscow and Beijing since the mid-1950s and the death of Stalin. Deng openly opposed Mao's approach and argued against expensive investment in an enlarged military. In response to the weakening of his position as a paramount leader of China during the Great Leap Forward, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution in 1966. This was designed as a movement to purify the culture of China through a species of constant revolution, whereby counter-revolutionaries and any unreformed capitalists and bourgeois elements would be rooted out. In reality, it was an effort by Mao to galvanize his own support base and reclaim full control of the state. It quickly spun out of control as gangs of younger Chinese secondary school and university students formed into violent Red Guards who terrorized their own teachers and parents for not being ideologically fervent enough. In time, the government had to resort to programs whereby the Red Guards were sent to the countryside from the cities to try to reform their ideological fervor. Between 1 and 2 million people would be killed in atrocities across China over the next decade as the Cultural Revolution went on and on. The attacks included vendettas against a great many senior Communist Party figures. Amongst these were Deng and his close ally Liu Shaoqi, both of whom were accused of being unreformed bourgeois right-wingers on account of their earlier stated views on economic policy. Owing to all of this, Deng would spend the late 1960s and much of the early 1970s on the periphery of Chinese politics, though eventually, in 1973, under the patronage of his old ally Zhou Enlai, he was restored to the party hierarchy in Beijing and acquired new positions of authority. In February 1972, Richard Nixon visited China as the first post-communist-era president of the United States to do so. Since 1949, the US had largely acknowledged the Republic of China on the island of Taiwan as the legitimate government of China. But with the passage of more than 2 decades, the US was anxious to develop economic relations with mainland China. Nixon's administration also perceived that China had a role to play in bringing the Vietnam War to an end in a way which saved American face as much as possible, as it was a war which it was currently losing but was still fighting. The state visit began the process of normalization of US-China relations, and eventually, in 1979, the administration of President Jimmy Carter would acknowledge the People's Republic of China. Deng played a major role in this process, both as a more junior figure within the communist regime in the early to mid-1970s, and after he became the leader of China in the late 1970s. This was a vitally important episode in modern history, as it paved the way for China's economic miracle by opening the US market to the goods China was beginning to produce in ever greater quantities. This aside, Deng's character was not always popular amongst senior American politicians, with some, such as Henry Kissinger, labeling him a, quote, nasty little man, a view shared by many people in the Nixon administration and beyond. Zhou Enlai died in January 1976. His death was soon followed by mass protests and violence at Tiananmen Square on the 5th of April 1976, as discontent at the Cultural Revolution and Mao's rule boiled over. On the day, large crowds congregated to pay their respects to Zhou, who was highly regarded among the populace. Those in attendance were considered counter-revolutionaries and were labeled as such by the Communist Party's Central Committee, who afterwards sought Deng's arrest for the alleged planning of the event. Deng himself had remained largely absent from the square, although he had been spotted visiting an area close by. As a result, he was accused of leading the protesters, a claim he strongly denied, but which meant that he lost his status as a senior member of the Communist Party and was removed from his position as vice premier. 100,000 people descended on the square and riots broke out, with government buildings being taken over. Security forces, led by the Gang of Four that had obtained substantial power during the Cultural Revolution, cleared the square with a militia. The Tiananmen Square incident not only led to Deng's dismissal from his positions, he was also placed under house arrest by the regime. But then, only 5 months after the riots, an ailing Mao Zedong died of a heart attack on the 9th of September 1976 at the age of 82 years old. Thereafter, Deng was quickly rehabilitated within the party, and indeed his resistance to Mao's growing autocracy from the late 1950s onwards and alternate vision for China's economic development made him a frontrunner to become Mao's successor. In the course of 1977, he was restored as the vice premier and also promoted to become vice chairman of the Chinese Communist Party and vice chairman of the Military Commission and Army Chief of Staff. Hua Guofeng, a military leader, was made the temporary leader of China during a transitional period following Mao's death, while the infamous Gang of Four were attacked by the government they had so recently led, with several members spending much of the 1980s and 1990s imprisoned. With the end of the Cultural Revolution and a severe swing in China's politics following Mao's death, Deng was pronounced as the paramount leader of the People's Republic of China in 1978 and became the de facto leader of the communist state. Deng would rule China for the best part of a decade and a half, down to the early 1990s. The era of his leadership became known for policies collectively known as Luan Fanzheng, a term which translates to something close to eliminating chaos and returning to normal. A clear statement about how China was leaving behind the instability and violence of Mao's time as head of state and moving progressively forwards. The Cultural Revolution was very firmly brought to an end, and reprisals were sought against those who had led the violence. Ideological divisions were toned down, and the communist government became much more tolerant. Gone was the unrepentant quasi-Stalinist approach with the supreme disregard for the value of human life which Mao had displayed. In its place was a new government of stability,